Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode I'm joined by Alexander Downer, who was leader of the Liberal Party from 1994 to 95, as well as being Australia's longest serving Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1996 to 2007, and High Commissioner to the United Kingdom from 2014 to 18, but not the longest serving High Commissioner. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Alexander.
Thank you, Georgina, very much. It's a pleasure to be honoured.
Well, today we're going to talk about the Menzies you knew and how he influenced you, particularly as leader of the Liberal Party. You're one of his successors, and this podcast will be part of a series we're doing with the living Liberal leaders from John Howard onwards. Or would it be John Hewson onwards, actually?
John Howard was the leader before John Hewson.
Yes. Yeah. So from
then Andrew Peacock, then John Hewson, then me, then John Howard again.
Then Brendan Nelson, then Malcolm Turnbull, then Tony Abbott. And we will get through them all in due course. We have, of course, already spoken to John Howard, which was fantastic. But Alexander, one of your claims is that you, one of the few people, probably the only Liberal leader to have met all leaders of the Liberal Party.
Well, John Howard has as well.
Yeah.
So, yes, it's not much of a claim because in one or two cases I've only briefly met them. Billy McMahon, for example, came to London when my father was the High Commissioner, and Billy McMahon was the Prime Minister at the time, and I can remember briefly meeting him and not having a conversation of any substance with him. But for the rest of them, I would have known them in varying degrees quite well, so it's not much of a claim.
Still, it's a claim you make.
It's a claim.
So, Robert Menzies, and we have talked about him before on this podcast, but to remind those who might have missed that episode, tell me about your recollections of meeting him.
Well, I met him many times because my father was one of his ministers, and not only that, but my father had a very close friendship with Robert Menzies. So I can remember him when I was a child, a relatively small child, coming to stay with us when we lived in the Adelaide Hills, and Menzies was making brief visits to Adelaide. On more recent occasions, I remember him well in the UK when my father was the High Commissioner there and we were living in the UK. And Robert Menzies became the Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, as it's called. And we went down to Walmer Castle, which is the official home of the Lord Warden, and had lunch there with him and Dame Patty one day. And beyond that, when he was the Prime Minister, my father was an MP, we would go to Canberra for the school holidays often. And as a child, I would go round to the lodge and play cricket with Robert Menzies' nephew. And the Prime Minister would come back home to the lodge for lunch, and he would come and watch us playing.
Would he bowl a few balls at you?
I don't remember him bowling a few balls, but I remember his absolute fascination with cricket and his huge knowledge of cricket.
We have about 200 books in the Menzies collection on cricket, so he was certainly fascinated by cricket and reading about cricket. And we also have on display the uniform he wore when he was installed as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, which is a spectacular uniform, although I understand he didn't wear it very often. It was
just for the swearing in.
Just for the swearing in, yeah. So you were alive for quite a portion of the Menzies government, Mark II, being born in
almost all of it.
Almost all of it,
Not quite
yes.
all of it. But.
So you're born in 1951, and he obviously retired from politics and the Prime Ministership in 66. You were a young boy then, but I guess you experienced and to this day still appreciate the legacies of his government. What do you think are the key legacies of the Menzies government?
So the first thing is my recollection of the Menzies government is as a child. So my recollection is an era of great stability. That's how I perceived it. Robert Menzies was in the lodge and God was in his heaven. All seemed well with the world, and for that matter, Thomas Playford was the Premier of South Australia through many of those years as well. So there was that sense of stability, I think a sense that Bob Menzies knew what he was doing, and a lot could just be left to him. So people, I don't think, were anything like as questioning of what the government does as they are today, were nothing like as contentious as they are today. I think society was a good deal calmer.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it was because there was just less state intervention in our lives, so there was less to quibble over, or?
No, because there were many, particularly in the Labour Party, who were very enthusiastic about the notion of state intervention and state control. So it's not as though that wasn't part of the public agenda, but I think people, look, on a whole, were less educated, substantially less educated, actually, than they are today. And as a function of that, may have been less questioning, more ready to accept the leadership of authority figures rather than challenging everything they did, questioning everything they did. Media was, of course, very different. You didn't have social media. You had radio and television. I can't remember life without television, although I was literally born before Australia had television.
Yes, but it was 1956,
I mean,
wasn't
I was
it?
5.
Melbourne Olympics, yeah.
I was 5 when it came in.
Yeah.
My parents, by the way, wouldn't buy a television for many, many years. In fact, I don't think until 1972 did we have a television in our house, because my parents thought television would be bad for the children. Not sure whether many people would agree that's turned out to be the case. It might have been better if we had had television.
Your recollections of his government were of one of stability. In terms of your views on what he left us as a legacy, though, was it?
Steady growth, growing home ownership, rising living standards, steady immigration program, growing population, but on the whole an extraordinarily harmonious and increasingly prosperous society. Good and steady allies of the United States and Great Britain, always could rely on them. So in that sense, I suppose it would be best to describe it as an era where the country seemed under control. So I don't think there has been any Prime Minister in my lifetime who has given the country a greater sense of stability and comfort. The worst that is said about the Menzies era by people like Paul Keating is that these were the Rip Van Winkle years, that our country just slept through. Well, what was the country meant to be doing? What do people like that wish it was? A country in turmoil, in vicious debate, in conflict. But it wasn't. It was a period of steady achievement, of extraordinary achievement, effectively full employment throughout that period. So,
yes, there was one stage, I think in the 1950s, when I think there are only 3 people who are noted as unemployed in South Australia. Such was the low level of unemployment.
Gold bludgers.
You wonder about them, don't you? Alexander, your family has a long history of political involvement, and really pre-Federation, quite extraordinary, almost unmatched, I would say, in modern Australian political history. How has your family history informed your own political views?
Well, I think there are 2 things to say about that. First of all, I think through my family history, I grew up believing in the value of public service. There was something essentially meritorious about going into Parliament. It was an achievement. If you became an MP, there was a sense that you had really achieved something in life, particularly if you were a good MP. If you became a minister, there was virtue in being a minister because of what you could contribute to the community. So I say all of that because I think nowadays people don't see becoming an MP or, as I like to say, becoming a politician, becoming a minister or even a prime minister as particularly meritorious.
You think that's changed a lot?
I do think that's changed a lot. I don't think it's seen as anything like as virtuous as it was then. I mean, people would think, well, to become a cabinet minister, to become the chairman of BHP, to become a High Court judge, these were all definitions of great achievement. Nowadays, I think becoming a cabinet minister would be seen at the lower order of those. Because I think the reputation of politics and politicians has declined, not because politics and politicians have necessarily declined so much, but because public attitudes and public expectations have changed so much.
I think that is something that Menzies viewed very much so, that there was a sense of honour in being an MP representing your people, your electorate, but also the greater Australian population in Parliament, and what you could achieve through that office to progress your nation was fundamentally of worth and a good thing to be valued.
Well, more than that, there was no greater contribution you could make to your society than to become one of its members of Parliament and ultimately to become a minister, or even at the very peak of it, the Prime Minister. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I grew up believing that. Believing as a child, if I made money one day, that wouldn't be particularly meritorious. It would be better to have money than not to have money, but it wasn't for me a definition of success because it wasn't perceived in my family as a definition of success. It was a nice thing to have, but not a definition of great success. Serving the nation was a definition of great success. I suppose the second thing is that, to use the phrase I like to use, as a family, I wasn't brought up in an environment that believed in revolution, that was, on the whole, happy with the way society was evolving, or always recognising that things change and things sometimes need to be changed. But I grew up believing that. So some people grow up with a sense from, coming from their families and their family circumstances and so on, with a sense of discontent with society. Whereas I grew up thinking society worked fairly well for all its flaws. So I didn't grow up a revolutionary.
Do you think, though, that was because you grew up in a particularly privileged environment or lucky environment that you didn't get a sense that things were all that bad? I mean, that would be what your critics might say.
Well, critics use the term privilege because they value money more than anything else, whereas I don't use the term privilege in relation to money. We had money, but we weren't super rich, but we had plenty of money, able to afford private schools and holidays and things. But no, the greatest privilege is loving parents and parents who care for you. So if you're underprivileged, that really for me means your parents didn't really care for you sufficiently. Or even if you're from a single parent family, that single parent didn't care for you sufficiently. So I would say in that sense I was very privileged because I had 3 sisters and both of my parents loved all 4 of us, and that gave us confidence as human beings, and it meant we grew up in a stable environment. So in that circumstance, you're probably not going to become a revolutionary.
Your grandfather, Sir John Downer, who was a Premier of South Australia and then one of the drafters of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, and then, of course, became one of the first senators in the Parliament of Australia, Senator for South Australia. He was always on the centre-right of politics. He wasn't obviously part of the Labor movement. What was it about his liberalism that characterised the way he contributed to public life? Was there some sense of John Downer liberalism or conservatism or philosophical tradition?
He died in 1915 in his 70s. So inevitably he didn't have much influence on me, if any influence on me at all, except through my father. And my father was only 5 years old when he died, so the amount of influence he had on my father would have been very limited. So what I would say about him was he was a nation builder, to use a word I like to use, which is something I also see as meritorious as somebody who is committed to building a nation. In his case, he'd been the Premier of the colony of South Australia on a couple of occasions, but he invested a good deal of his time in making a contribution to the creation of federation and to making it a workable federation. So that was his greatest achievement. And that was a huge achievement. Federation, after all, has been an unequivocal success. What is more, he was one of the three drafters of the Constitution. He was on the three-man drafting committee of the Constitution. And the Constitution has really lasted incredibly well. It's turned out to be a document which has been able to adapt to changing eras without radical political upheaval. So I would say in that sense he left quite a legacy. He wasn't the Premier of long enough of South Australia to leave much of a legacy there, except he brought the Chaffey brothers to the Riverland. And so the irrigation of the Riverland was very much one of his projects, one of his achievements. Beyond that, giving married women property rights and one or two social reforms like that he was involved in, one could include in his legacy. But no, he was clearly a very substantial figure. He was a QC and then a KC, so he was a prominent barrister in Adelaide as well.
And that was, of course, at a time when politicians would often keep career going in whatever they had been doing before they entered Parliament.
He did when he was in state politics. Then he went into the Senate in the first federal Parliament and then left the Senate, by the way, disappointed and let down because he felt that he had been given a commitment by Edmund Barton, who was his friend, to become one of the first High Court judges. But the Parliament decided there would only be 3 High Court judges instead of 5. So he was one of the 2 people to miss out, left the Senate, went back into the South Australian Legislative Council and went back to the bar because he didn't get paid much. They were paid, I think, federal politicians right from the beginning, but didn't get paid much and had to spend his time in Melbourne, which is where the federal parliament met at that time. And it just financially couldn't sustain that. So with disappointment, which politics brings with it quite a lot of disappointment as well as exhilaration. With disappointment, came back to Adelaide, went back to the bar and went to the Legislative Council.
So, as you say, you and your father didn't get an opportunity to imbibe Sir John Downer's political philosophy from him directly. But you and your father would have spoken a lot about politics. He was, of course, an immigration minister in the Menzies government in the 50s and 60s. So what was it about your father's political philosophy that you carried on?
So I guess I have carried it on, but it's hard to put your finger on that, actually. He was, after all, very much an economic protectionist, whereas I have been always an economic rationalist.
And you see that in the evolution of Liberal Party policies on economics. So Menzies' government did continue protectionism that was really from federation, and there were various policies that were, very much the economic geist of the time, the Keynesian policies about investing heavily in big infrastructure projects and pumping up the economy. You wouldn't do them these days with as much gusto as they were adopted back then, but that was very much the understanding of centre-right governments around the world, that was economic policy framework that worked.
It did work, but then there wasn't the intense international competition that there subsequently was. And as the world changed, it's possible, my father could have changed his views on economics, and we just don't know, because he died in 1981. But I would say he wasn't overly focused on economics, whereas as a politician, I had been very interested in economics, was the shadow treasurer for a while, as well as foreign policy. My father had a great passion for immigration, which he also thought was part of the nation-building project that we needed to build up our population. And, he believed in a fairly diverse population, but he was also very interested in foreign policy. So they were his particular interests. I suppose people would say I'd inherit my conservatism from my father or my mother and my grandparents. I suppose so, but I actually think it's more than that. I think it's to do with the environment in which you grow up. I didn't grow up in an environment where we, as a family, wanted to see society radically recast. So in that sense, I inherited my father's politics, certainly inherited his enthusiasm for the Liberal Party. But, I mean, I have different views from him on some things and not on others. He was socially surprisingly liberal for his generation. In many ways, he was, I think, to use a term that was used more then than now, he was a very tolerant person. So he understood that people had different lifestyles and preferences, and then you should just let it alone. My mother was pretty much the same. She used to quote that old cliche, "It takes all sorts to make a world, dear." So when you would criticise a particular group of people, she would just shrug her shoulders and say that. So both my parents were, I think the best way to describe it is tolerant people. You never found them denouncing whole categories of people on the basis of their sexual preference or their race or
identity.
Their identity, yeah.
You have described yourself in the past as a progressive conservative, which, I mean, in these days, the term progressive has probably a different connotation than what it did when you first started using that term. How would you define that?
The word progressive has been taken over by the political left. So they now describe themselves as progressive, whereas they used to describe themselves as socialists. But when they found that the word socialism didn't resonate very well with the punters, they decided to change.
It went down poorly in the focus group.
It went down poorly in the focus group. So they have co-opted the word progressive, which is a pity. So by progressive conservative, I think the notion of being a conservative sounds reactionary. It sounds as though as a conservative, all you want to do is conserve.
Put things in aspic and never allow anything to change, yes.
Yeah. So I never thought that. I've always thought that everything changes. We all know that. Society needs to adapt to changing demands, changing needs. It adapts for sure to changing fashions as well.
Yeah.
Because political ideas are very much driven, as clothes designing is, by fashion. So, I mean, I've always been of the view that we have to adapt to changing circumstances. And at our best, we should be, and this is a very hazardous undertaking, try to anticipate changes that might take place in the future so that we're prepared for them. So in that sense, I've been a progressive conservative because I don't believe, conservative to this extent, I don't believe at all in changing things for the sake of changing them. If something's working very well and is likely to continue to work very well, then I would leave it well alone.
Do you think that's how you would define Menzies liberalism, as a progressive conservatism?
For sure, yeah. I certainly would. I wouldn't say I had developed these thoughts on the basis of, Sir Robert Menzies, but he definitely was. He was definitely somebody who understood the need to make changes as circumstances changed or were likely to change. And he changed his approach to things as the years wore on. But he didn't, see any virtue in casting out what worked well or alienating great sections of the community by wanting to change things. So he would have said, well, this is a country with a British heritage, so we don't want to trash the British heritage. But, that would cause huge offence to a large percentage of the country and would be denigrating the country's history, which is not a good idea if you want to build up a country's self-confidence and capacity to succeed. On the other hand, he knew that we had to adapt to the requirements of incoming generations of migrants who came from other parts of the world.
And that leads me to my next question, actually, about immigration. So your father was immigration minister, and this was a period during the Menzies era of huge influx in migrants, and was part of a nation-building project because there was a sense that Australia wasn't going to be able to grow and progress as a nation without a whole lot more people, and we weren't going to do that just on the basis of natural growth, even though I think at one point birth rate reached about 3.56, which was the highest it ever reached in Australia's history. It was supplemented hugely by immigrants, predominantly from initially the UK and Ireland, and then, of course, Southern Europe. And as the White Australia policy was whittled down, then migrants came from other parts of the world. There's a big argument in Australia about big Australia versus not so big Australia, small Australia. You've fallen on the side of bigger Australia in the past. How does that sit with your conception of big L Liberal and small L Liberal policies?
Well, I think that big old Liberal, the Liberal Party, has been the great party of migration in Australia. It's brought huge numbers of migrants. Liberal governments have brought huge numbers of migrants to Australia during their terms in office. Well, it is part of this notion of building the nation. This sense of mission that people have had over the years, that Australia is a new, modern Australia, not of course historic Australia, but modern Australia is a new country, and we want to build this new society here, but you can't build it without migrants. And so continuing the process of advancing Australia involves having an immigration program. And I've always believed you need a very carefully thought out and planned immigration program. I think random immigration is going to lead to chaos, but a well-constructed immigration program can prove to be incredibly successful, as it has been for Australia. I mean, of all the countries which have immigration policies, I think Australia must be pretty much the most successful. It's been extraordinarily successful. To use a phrase, in deciding who comes to the country and the circumstances in which they come. That, after all, is very much a Liberal Party slogan. But absolutely, not having random immigration, but having planned immigration. And I think we should stick with it. I don't think Australia, it's a huge continent, should abandon its ambition of continuing to build a great country here on this continent, instead of just having an ambition to manage what we have, or even that some people have an ambition to manage decline because they see the decline of Western values and the Western economic model as inevitable. So all we need to do now is manage our decline, our regression. Well, I don't share any of that.
You have lived for some time in the UK. They have their problems with immigration and border control. And of course, part of the Brexit result in 2016 was around immigration and taking back control. How do you see the differences in migration between the two countries, given they come from similar foundations in terms of their philosophy and governance systems?
So I think in essence, Australia and the UK have the same attitude to immigration. In essence, they do. The public are happy enough in the UK with immigration. They're not against immigration, and they never were. So this is a complete misunderstanding of the Brexit vote. What they're against is uncontrolled, chaotic immigration. And I think Australians are exactly the same. The British are not xenophobic people. They, on the whole, warmly welcome migrants. It is Europe's most multicultural society. And I would say it's Europe's, if not the world's, least. It is arguably, the UK is arguably the world's least racist society, where any hint of racism is leapt on and condemned. Of course, it is in America and Australia and for that matter in Italy and France and other Western countries, but not in non-Western countries. It's not spoken of, largely because I think in many parts of the world racism is still widely accepted as the norm. But in the UK, people don't vote on the basis of race. Promotions in the workplace are not really made on the basis of race. So you have seen an attempt to introduce American identity politics into the UK, but I think the public are pretty resistant to all of that. And after all, the UK has a Prime Minister, a Foreign Secretary and a Home Secretary, Secretary being a senior minister, a cabinet minister, who are non-white. And, you know, people don't even talk about it, they don't take any notice of it, really. Doesn't mean anything to them. I suppose a legacy of empire. The British Empire was obviously whatever you think of it, was obviously multiracial. And so the British people were very used to people of different races in the way that Hungarians may not be.
You were I do want to get on to your period as Liberal leader, but just before we do, you were Foreign Minister from 96 to 2007, a period when Australia was still taking reasonable levels of migrants. Tell me, how did the legacy of White Australia play out while you were Foreign Minister? Was that still an issue, even though we had dumped it largely by...
It's just a domestic issue.
Right.
Not a foreign policy issue. Well,
because our critics will often say, our regional neighbours see Australia as fundamentally a racist society. It's a hangover from White Australia policy and...
Yeah, critics within Australia say it, but I didn't. I was the Foreign Minister for nearly 12 years. I didn't ever come across it. I didn't come across people criticising the Australia of the 1940s or 50s. What do they want to do? Get into a slanging match about the history of their countries? And if you stop and think about other countries in the region, they have their own legacies, and including legacies in relation to race. And so you're not going to go to Japan and have people condemning Australia because it's got so many white people in it, given the Japanese attitude to immigration. You're not going to go to Malaysia and find people saying, we're really worried about your race policies in Australia, when they themselves have institutionalised race policies, which, they've put in place for whatever reasons they've done it. Anybody who knows about the history of modern Malaysia knows how that's all happened. But, people aren't going to get into an argument about those issues. People are looking at the present and moving forward into the future.
I wanted to talk about your time as leader, but of course we need to discuss the letdown, disappointment of the 93 election, which led to your leadership. What was it like going into the 93 election? You had the big fight back policy statement, a really big set of ideas and policies to take to the 93 election. Paul Keating seemed very much on the nose as Prime Minister. And yet it all came very unexpectedly, I might say, crumbling down.
Well, it gradually did, actually. We started off with the launch of Fight Back, which was initially applauded by the public, but then dissected quite effectively by the Labour Party and by their fellow travellers, and poorly defended, I guess, by John Hewson. People like Peter Reith and John Howard and me, Peter Costello, we all made a huge effort to defend it. But anyway, it was gradually dissected. The public became anxious about it. So our position in the polls gradually declined, and might have gone into the 93 election with a small lead and therefore full of hope. But as the election wore on, things went from bad to worse. The election campaign started off quite well, but then it gradually went bad, as they say. So by the time the election day arrived, we weren't so surprised that we lost, but it was nevertheless a huge disappointment. For somebody like me who'd gone into the Parliament at the end of 1984 and been Shadow Minister for many things in the meantime, yet again to lose an election was pretty depressing.
Mm. Do you think that spooked Liberals because they saw going to an election with a big agenda as failing, and to do that again was risky, to be taken down by your political opponents?
Well, it's often said that it's best to go into an election without policies or with minimal policies, to use the phrase that's always used, to have a small target strategy. I think no two elections are the same. So I think now for the Liberal Party, it has to rebuild itself with quite substantial policies, because it has gone for a few years, not just for a few months, by the way, but for a few years at both the state and federal level, sometimes in government, without any sort of defining policy direction. It just looks sort of directionless. So it probably needs now to go into a phase of rebuilding its policy foundations. So Fight Back came after a huge debate in the Liberal Party about where it was going, the sort of things that you read today about the Liberal Party were written in the late 1980s, early 1990s about the Liberal Party. And so also the Liberal Party was very divided, actually more divided than it is now, between the wets and the dries. Mainly that was less about social issues and more about economic issues. So the wets, who now are called the moderates, they were against economic rationalism, bringing down tariffs and privatization, all of these sort of well-known components of a rational economic model. They were against all of that. But it was a bit of a generational change. The younger members, as they then were, of Parliament after the mid-1980s were, on the whole, economic rationalists, whatever they thought about social issues. Probably socially fairly liberal, but economically very liberal. And there was a huge debate in the party about all of that, which culminated really in the loss of the 1990 election, where Andrew Peacock led the party to defeat, and a sense that, well, we just have to try something different. And so John Hewson, who'd been the shadow treasurer, was not unanimously, actually, because I personally didn't vote for him.
Who did you vote for?
I voted for Peter Reith in 1990 after the election. But Peter Reith, I think, got 12 votes. It wasn't one of his more successful campaigns. Peter Reith became the deputy leader. John Hewson became the leader and was given carte blanche by the party, really, to come up with a policy program which culminated in the production of Fight Back. And their party really rallied around Fight Back. And so, although you could argue that Fight Back led to the party's defeat in the 1993 election, I'm not sure about that, actually. I don't think it's possible to prove that one way or the other. Because without Fight Back, the Liberal Party still would have looked directionless and meaningless. And that might have been problematic for it in the 1993 election. But anyway, although the party lost the election, and although Hewson said after the election, when he was re-elected the leader, because John Howard challenged him to the leadership, I voted for John Howard on that occasion. I'm one of very few people who was a member of the Liberal Parliamentary Party at that time who never voted for John Hewson. I never thought he was the business myself. I thought he would make an awful Prime Minister. I thought that. But we don't know. Maybe I would have been wrong. But I think the legacy of Fight Back lived on. I think the policies lived on, and much of Fight Back was implemented by the Howard government.
So you took over from John Hewson in May 1994.
Yeah.
So what did you come to the leadership believing and seeking to achieve? What were the things that drove you? Obviously winning, beating Labor.
Yeah, so that was clearly a driving factor. But I was, as I've been describing, an economic rationalist, so I certainly believed in much of Fight Back. I mean, I didn't really personally have much of an argument with any of Fight Back in policy terms. There were questions about how much of it was politically toxic. So there was a component of the health policy in Fight Back which turned out to be politically very controversial. So really, I thought what we needed to do is tone down our zeal a bit, that we shouldn't abandon all that we had been arguing for the last few years, but we should do so with less zeal. We should take the sharp edges off Fight Back. Well, so Fight Back as a document had been abandoned, but the policies in it, not so much. We should concentrate on the weaknesses of the Labor government. I mean, in terms of other policy areas, of foreign policy or defence policy or Indigenous policy or whatever it was, I didn't come there with a radical agenda. I think our positions on those issues had been well set for a long period of time and they didn't require any adjustment. What was a big issue at that time, made a big issue by Paul Keating, was the Republic.
Of course.
So this was one of those issues where the Liberal Party atomised, and that was hugely difficult to manage. So I, as a progressive conservative, thought, well, you don't want to have a constitutional upheaval. I've always been against constitutional upheaval. I've seen too much of the world playing around with constitutions to think there was any virtue in that. There has to be a really compelling case put to me to change the constitution. However, a lot of people felt very strongly about it, including in the Liberal Party. It was a fashion. It is not now. But the Republic was a fashionable issue at the time. Now it's Indigenous issues. Not to gainsay the importance of these issues, but just to say they are the fashionable issue of the time.
And why so much in the mid-90s was the Republic a
Because Paul
issue?
Keating made it one.
Because of Paul Keating's leadership on this.
I mean, his whole approach was, I've often said the politician most like Paul Keating was Eamon de Valera. We have to know a bit about Irish politics to know who Eamon de Valera was. But he was the first Prime Minister of Ireland and was a legendary Irish nationalist figure, but he was very hardline and very anti-British, so anti-British that he declared neutrality between Hitler and Churchill. That, I'd say, is a very clear definition of being anti-British.
And Menzies actually went to Ireland to plead with Eamon de Valera to get him to allow British ships to
use the treaty ports.
Yeah, the treaty ports, and he refused.
Yeah. And that was pretty anti-British.
Wow.
There's a sort of a strain of Irish politics which is very anti-British, and Paul Keating is part of that. He hates the British, always decrying the British, attacking the British for the fall of Singapore and so on. So he was against the British monarchy, of course, made a huge issue of it, speeches about it, denounced it, not denounced the Queen herself, but denounced the institution of the monarchy. And so, it became a fashionable issue. Journalists who always flock to the issue, to fashionable issues, they very seldom are analytical. They're usually just driven by fashions. They flocked to this issue as well. So there was huge, seemingly huge support for a republic. So I thought, well, how are we going to manage this when the Liberal Party is so divided? And I came up with this idea that we would hold, this sort of born out of my grandfather having been on constitutional conventions, that we would have a constitutional convention and at least have some of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention elected. And this Constitutional Convention could then work out whether, as a convention, it wanted to develop a model for a republic, and then that could be put to a vote if they agreed on a model. Well, I mean, I didn't last very long as the leader, but it came to pass. The Liberals were elected in 1996, and John Howard, as the Prime Minister, instituted this policy, which led to the Constitutional Convention and then the 1999 referendum.
And speaking of divisions within the Liberal Party, of course, the two key figures leading the yes and the no sides of the debate both became Liberal Party leaders themselves, in Tony Abbott for the monarchy and Malcolm Turnbull for the Republic.
Exactly.
It's quite amazing, really, when you reflect on it.
It is extraordinary.
Yeah, and both Prime Ministers, of course.
And both became leaders of the party and Prime Ministers. In any case, that was a huge issue at the time.
Do you think it's as divisive as the Voice debate is?
I do, yeah. I do think it is. Well, I don't know about within the Liberal Party. I think Liberals are much more opposed to Conservatives, and sort of soft conservative, progressive Conservatives are much more united in their opposition to the Voice than there was the case on the Republic. I mean, the sense I get of the shadow cabinet is, well, there was Julian Leeser who resigned, and Simon Birmingham was obviously opposed to it, although he hasn't resigned. And otherwise, they're pretty much against the Voice. Whereas on the Republic, they were very divided. They weren't evenly divided. The majority of them were in favour of maintaining the current system. But the minority was a pretty vocal minority. And a bit with the Voice. So the Voice campaign reminds me a bit of this. It was the fashion of the day. And so journalists, one by one, poured in their support for the Republic, ridiculed anybody who was opposed to the Republic. If you ever did an interview opposing the Republic, they would try to find some peccadillo in the interview, which they could really zero in on. Well, you find that with the Voice as well. And so, with the Labour Party, they were united in their support for the Republic. The Liberals were divided. So there was a huge journalistic focus on the divisions in the Liberal Party. Well, there weren't divisions in the Labour Party, to be fair to them, so there was nothing to focus on.
What's the lesson then for the Liberals today when it comes to approaching the Voice? You obviously have Peter Dutton coming out saying party policy is now to oppose the Voice. They've got an alternative suggestion of constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples and then these establishment of regional voices through legislation. But for the Liberals who are divided on this issue, how do they navigate?
I don't think they are very divided on this issue, not in the way they were on the Republic. I think there's a much stronger sense of unity and opposition to the Voice. It obviously isn't any opposition to the recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution because, after all, the Howard government put that to a referendum in 1999.
Which failed.
It spectacularly failed. Only 39% of people voted for it. It was a harmless recognition in the preamble, so it was quite surprising how the Labour Party and others vigorously opposed it. But I guess the focus of that referendum campaign was much more on the Republic than on the preamble of the Constitution. But now I think with the Voice is, of course, not just about recognition, it's about establishing an institution which the executive and the parliament are obliged to consult and therefore not to ignore, but to take seriously. I think it's not surprising that that second part of it is much opposed by Liberal Party people, be they MPs or members of the Lay Party. So, the best I can give them any advice. They've got to work out how they handle these things themselves, but unity will be strength, and members of the Shadow Cabinet in particular, the more prominent members of the Parliamentary Liberal Party, need to be out there arguing their case.
Well, Alexander, thank you very much for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's been a wonderful discussion, very wide-ranging, and it's great to have you on Afternoon Light for a second time.
It's a great pleasure, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.